I'm Roy. I am an alcoholic.
Hey, Roy.
My sobriety date is July 8th of 2003, which means in 8 days I'll be celebrating 20 years of sobriety. Continuous. No cheating, whatever. So anyway, we're going to start my story at the very beginning. I was born February 4th, 1963 in a little town in the mountains of Colorado. And I was very messed up physically. I had a hole in my diaphragm, which is the muscle that separates the stomach from the chest. That's what makes us breathe. And all my internal organs were in my chest. This was 1963. And so the doctor pretty much quickly realized that I probably was not going to survive. So he suggested to my parents that they just let nature take back its mistake. And that upset my dad greatly. So him and my mom stayed in the hospital. But him and a neighbor took me and drove quickly from Salida, Colorado to Colorado Springs, which is about an hour and a half away. And as they were going over mountain passes, and I kept dying. And I would stop breathing for minutes at a time, and then I'd come back. They called the doctor, and they met them there at the emergency room, put me on a table, sliced me open without any anesthesia. I was 2 days old, and they started rearranging my organs. They sutured me back together. They accidentally left a kidney up in my chest, and they thought it was a water pocket, so they punctured it, which sent me into shock. I survived it. They did not think I would survive it, but obviously here I am today. I survived it. So it was touch and go, and I'm not going to go into the whole story, but it was a miracle. It was documented in medical journals. It was a big deal. 2 months later, the hole broke open again, and all my organs went back upstairs. So they took me back to Colorado Springs, did the same thing, sewed me back up, shipped me home. I was okay until December of that year, New Year's Eve. They were in Arizona visiting an aunt, and it broke open again. And they took me to an emergency room in Phoenix, actually Tempe, which is outside of Phoenix. And there happened to be, this was New Year's Eve, and the doctor, the emergency surgeon on call, happened to have been a surgeon who him and another man had just developed a process with a Marlex gauze, which was a stretchable gauze. And they put it over my diaphragm, and it grew with me, and it saved my life. It was like a miracle. From that moment on, I was known as the miracle child, okay? This is going to come into play a little bit later. The other thing was I was diagnosed because of all the oxygen I'd lost that I was probably going to be mentally retarded, and I was certainly going to be physically unable to function. I'm going to have a lot of limitations. They assumed that I probably would not have a long survival. They told my parents if I could survive to 5, there would be a good possibility that I could go on and grow up. Do not expect to be able to get me into school. Just do the best I could with me. Okay. I'm telling you all this to let you understand that until I was 22 years old, when I went through treatment, I went through my whole life believing I was mentally retarded. Nobody told me I wasn't, okay? So they figured out around 4 or 5 that I wasn't, but they didn't let me in on that little secret. So the other thing too is that they were very, very concerned about, anyone hurting me or whatever. So they got me into school. I was extremely hyperactive and very mouthy. I know you're shocked by that. Very funny. I would just, whatever is in my head, just fell right out of my mouth. And anyway, so I went through. I guess I was an average student. I mean, I was just kind of average. Little town in Colorado called Buena Vista, where I was raised. My father was a warden of a prison. And we were raised, there was the prison with the fence and everything, and then we had a big mansion right outside of that, and we had inmates that were getting ready to get out. They were called trustees, and they moved them out near us so to transition them back into society, and they were my playmates. you know. So my earliest playmates were convicted felons, and it turns out to be a really cool thing because as I aged, I've not had the judgment on certain things. When you're raised with people that are screwed up, you know, they were just the guys to me. They were not, you know, I never did ask them what were you in for. I mean, it just didn't matter. They were my playmates. They were my protectors. Anyway, so when I hit 6th grade, it was in like 1975, maybe 76, 75. There was a big movement going on called the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, and this is where women were trying to get equal rights, equal pay, equal benefits, so on and so forth. Well, it was a big deal because a lot of people were absolutely opposed. You know, women needed to be at home with the children and men needed to be the breadwinners. And I was from a rather liberal thinking family. My mom was probably a little more conservative and my dad was a little more liberal, but anyway, it was all over TV. They had a tennis match between Bobby Riggs and, what was her name? Billie Jean King, and you know, and she beat him. It was a big deal. And the Brady Bunch had a thing where Marcia tried out for football, and you know, and you remember that? And men were like, you know, going out for homecoming queen and all this stuff, and it was like this big thing. And I thought it would be hysterically funny if I tried out for cheerleader. Now let me set the scene here. I'm in a little bitty town in Colorado, rather conservative, and they'd never had a male cheerleader before. I really didn't want to be a cheerleader, but I thought it'd be really funny to try out. And I got a friend who was going to try out with me. And we got permission, and everyone was all hyped about me doing this. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard of. And I was getting all this attention and all this, you know, I was really into this. So I tried out, and I wasn't horrible, I wasn't good, but God, I got this overwhelming response, like everybody voted for me to become cheerleader. So here I was, Buena Vista's first male cheerleader. Funniest thing I ever did. Well, I didn't want to stay cheerleader. My plan was to go get cheerleader and then quit. Well, I was informed by my mother that we are not quitters. So I spent my 7th grade year as a cheerleader for Buena Vista. Now I'd also like to add a couple other things here. First off, I am not an athletic supporter. I know nothing about sports. The other thing too is that I'm gay. And I did not want anyone at that point in time to know. I was very scared. But because I became cheerleader, I became the target of bullying. And some very traumatic things occurred that year, both with the girls and the guys. And I understand it now. At the time, it was very confusing to me because I went from being this hero to being this horrible, horrible human being. And when you're in 7th grade, it's devastating. You know, all you want to do is be accepted. And everyone was against me. It was just a really traumatic time. The girls that had tried out all figured I had gotten their place as a cheerleader, so they were mad. All the guys were upset because I was riding the bus with all the cheerleaders, and they thought I was like going after their girlfriends. So the bullying started, the physical abuse, the psychological abuse, all that started. Meanwhile, at home, my dad ended up getting very, very sick with heart problems, and he ended up having heart surgery. Again, he was in charge of a large prison, and he went from being this very aggressive, manly man to not even being able to walk across the floor, from here to there without panting. And so he came home from that very angry, and the home life was just falling apart. It was unraveling. I'm the last of 5 kids. 3 of my older siblings were out of the house. It was just me and my sister. Very, very, very frightening time. So I was not safe at school. I was not safe at home. So guess where I turned? To the inmates. They were the safe place. So I would sneak over there at night, smoke my cigarettes, and all that stuff. And they just loved me. They just accepted me for whatever. I never cause any problem. Anyway, so anyway, I went through that in 8th grade, and then 9th grade, my freshman year in high school, was just hell. It was just hell at this point in time. I was suicidal. I was writing suicide poetry. I mean, it was just a really very difficult time. But I found theater. And it was in that moment when I was on stage and I had a script, I knew who I was in that moment. And, you know, people were applauding me and so on and so forth. So that probably saved my life. I had decided that one of two things was going to happen. I was either going to get out of that little town or I was going to kill myself. And so I told my mother one night, I said, I'm not staying here anymore. I'm not doing this. I'll go move in with my oldest sister who lived in Colorado Springs. And my mom was like, well, let's just wait and see what happens. Unbeknownst to me, they had already made a plan. My parents had already made a plan for my dad to retire and move, but I didn't know that. But anyway, we moved to Colorado Springs when I was 15. And I felt, you know, thank God I'm out of hell. Well, unfortunately, when we moved, I moved with me. And so I was scared of everything. I was scared of everything. I was scared of everybody. I did get back into theater. I must go back. So the inmates introduced me to marijuana. And the first few times I smoked with them, I didn't get high, but I was cool. For a moment, I fit that I wasn't getting high, so I didn't really understand the marijuana thing. Boy, I moved to Colorado Springs, and the first time I smoked there, I was so high I couldn't get off the ground. I was like, oh my God, I get it now. You know. And for that moment, I altered. So it was an interesting time. I ended up getting a job with a gentleman. He was 45, and I was 15, and I got a job with him. He had a little art store in Manitou Springs, and they thought I was hysterically funny. I mean, all my life, people have thought I was hysterically funny, and I am. I get it. I don't see things normal, and just, I'll share it with you. But anyway, so he had 3 sons that were all out of high school, and one of them was particularly good looking, and I would have done anything to get his attention, you know, type of deal. But anyway, they decided to get me drunk because I would be really funny drunk, right? So they brought some Coors beer, tall boys, and I had 3, and I chugged them. I really hated the taste of alcohol. In fact, from the moment I first drank my first sip of alcohol to my last, I never liked the taste. It was never about the taste for me. It was about the release, the relax. Anyway, so I drank 3 and got really, really, really buzzed, and he took me in the back room and went me away. I mean, I was at the store, and the place was spinning, and, you know, and it was miserable, you know. But they were having so much fun, and I was like the center of attention, and, you know, all that stuff. So that was the first time I got drunk. I discovered that during that time, you know, after that first one, I discovered beer, and because I was only, you know, then I turned 16. When I could get it, I would get, you know, enough to get buzzed, get 3 or 4 beers. I couldn't hold a whole lot because I get drunk really quick. But then the greatest thing happened. I discovered peppermint schnapps. I was at the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I love it, yeah. I went 30 some odd times. I had it all there. It was amazing. Anyway, I'm sitting there, they pass a bottle of schnapps, and I take a drink and pass it on. Don't feel anything. Pass it back, I take a drink. Anyway, I had 4 or 5 slugs of it. Didn't feel a thing, and I thought, this is stupid, until I stood up. And I was back in my seat, and I was messed up. And I thought, this is the greatest thing in the whole wide world. I found my solution at that moment. That I didn't care. Almost immediately, I was sexy, and I was smart. You know, at this point in time, I'm still retarded, right? But when I drank, I was smart. I was like you all. It was amazing. It was this elixir. So anyway, that got me started on that, and then we moved to Tallahassee, Florida, and I got a good friend whose dad owned a wine and cheese shop, and he got me introduced to the harder liquors, which became my best friend because I could drink really quick and get drunk. During that time, I didn't want to, okay, so one of the things that really confused me was that I was in school, I didn't like being in school, I was still in theater, really doing well in theater, but the rest of it was horrible. But I wanted to quit, my mom wouldn't let me, so I managed to graduate from high school. As a matter of fact, I graduated a semester early because I lied about the credits. Yeah. And they had gone from the handwritten thing when I moved from Colorado Springs to a computerized system, and I just made up that I'd taken algebra and all this stuff back in the day. I told them I'd taken French, and so I didn't have any of that. But anyway, I graduated from high school and I took a little bit of college, and meanwhile I drinking and I was smoking pot all the time and drinking when I could, and it just accelerated. Didn't see a problem. I wasn't hurting anybody. I did roll my car, and almost killed two of my friends, and wasn't coming home. And I would come home, but I was driving drunk, but I wasn't bothering anybody really. Wasn't hurting me at all except for the hangovers. I had a job. I kept a job. In fact, I started working at 15 at that art place, and always had a job. And my friends didn't, anyway, so it was on, and the more I got into alcohol and my alcoholism, the more normal I started feeling. It was very weird, and I guess that's the way for a lot of us, because none of the bad stuff had really started yet. Somewhere in all that, I ended up in Kansas. I don't recommend Kansas to people. was not a good time. I was there for like 3 or 4 years. But anyway, ended up working on a site. I went to, well, actually, the first time I got confronted about my drinking, I was going to a junior college in Hutchinson, Kansas, and everyone drank. I didn't realize that I drank different than everyone, but it was enough noted that the dorm mother came and confronted me. And I guess that the people had told her that I was drinking abnormally. So I'm like, okay, and they sent me off to one of the school counselors, and I was very compliant. The way I managed to go through life is if you confront me about something, okay. I'm not going to argue about it, like, okay, it's a path of least resistance. So they sent me to this guy, and he was really good looking. And I was happy to go to therapy. Now, I know that when we first started, it was because of my drinking. But I immediately derailed that and got off into other issues because I didn't want to talk about my drinking. I was protecting it. I didn't know that at the time. But we were talking about all kinds of stuff, the Bible and abuse and all this stuff. And by the way, I was raised in a Christian home, and all that was fine until a little bit later when people informed me that I was an abomination and was going to hell. And that was another issue during that time. But anyway, so I managed to manipulate him for every 2 or 3 months that I was seeing him. And at the end of it, I remember the last session, he said, "You've done a lot of really good work. How's your drinking?" I said, "Oh, it's fine." Good. And he felt very good about himself because he'd helped me. Ended up in Hays, Kansas, working at a psychiatric unit at night. There's some other things that, I guess I should go back to. At one point I was in Alabama, and I used to get engaged to women. They knew I was gay, but I would get engaged to them because it was like made them my enabler. And I've had to make some amends, and some of them I couldn't. But anyway, one of them, on one of those stops, I'd become a nursing assistant. So when I ended up in Hays, I worked in a psychiatric unit, and worked at night, and I drank every morning, and then would show up at work at night hungover. And one of my coworkers also drank a lot, and we would have throw up competitions and all that stuff, which only an alcoholic would do. We thought it was funny. The charge nurse there was a woman who had been in Alcoholics Anonymous. She was an alcoholic too, and she sort of knew what was going on, but she was really pretty cool about the whole thing. Anyway, somewhere in there, I got stopped one night drinking and driving, and I managed to talk my way out of it. And they're like, "Don't let us catch you again." So a week later, it was my day off, and I had walked to a bar because I didn't want to drink and drive. And I drank 2 or 3 Alabama Slammers and got hammered, and walked back and got in my car and took off. And a block later, the cops pulled me over. And I got out of the car, I said, "You caught me fair and square. You got me, I'm drunk." And they're like, "What?" "I'm drunk, you caught me fair and square." I thought it was the same cops. I didn't realize, I was out of my mind. So they're like, "Well, we got to do a sobriety test." And I just thought this was the funniest thing I'd ever done. I would like to explain my thought process. So they took me to jail. I was raised with a bunch of convicted felons. I was finally getting my street creds. I was not scared of jail. I mean, in my mind, it was like this adventure. I'm going to jail, And I'm drunk, and I'm funny, and I'm silly, and they're trying to ask me questions, and I'm just all over the place. And so they put me in the little room by myself, and I passed out the next morning. I was so hungover. And of course, they served scrambled eggs, But they took me in front of the judge, and I couldn't do it. He was talking, and he was reading off the charges, and I couldn't make heads or tails, so I was like, "Your Honor, can we do this another day, please?" Well, lo and behold, that's called a continuance. I didn't know it was a legal maneuver, but it was a legal maneuver, and so they put it off. And anyway, so I was found guilty of drinking and driving, and I pled no contest or whatever. And I had to go through drunk driving classes, and I was supposed to attend AA meetings, and I forget what I paid fines and all this stuff. So I went to one of the drunk driving classes, and I'll never forget the first thing the guy said is, "I know most of you are not alcoholics, as alcoholics don't get caught." And I thought, that's very weird, because at this point in time, I knew I had a drinking problem. I didn't see a problem with having a drinking problem. But then, so I don't remember much else except for we left, and like everyone made a beeline for the liquor store, but I didn't because I didn't want them to think I was an alcoholic. But anyway, so I also went to my first AA meeting, and this was in 1985, and they were a bit hostile at the first meeting. I was 22 years old. I didn't want to be there. I had a paper sign, and it felt like everyone in that room was about the age of Tom. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's really true, but I was still particularly young. And they were saying, there was a guy in there, maybe only one, I don't know who all, but he was saying things like, "I've spilled more than you ever drank. You're supposed to be young to. Get back out there, finish up." I had to get my paper signed. But the other thing that was really weird is one of my patients from the psychiatric unit was in there. She was an alcoholic. And I was like, "Oh shit, they're gonna..." Anyway, so what I found out was if I go through treatment, then I could get out of all the legal stuff at that point in time. So I did. I went through treatment at Valley Hope in Norton, Kansas. A couple things really important happened there. The first one was when I showed up to the treatment center, they had me take some testing. And one of them was called an MMPI, which is like a personality test. And you really don't lie on it. You just answer questions. And I was being very truthful, so I filled that out. But then the next one was called a Shipley test. And it was an IQ test. And the problem was I had been grading that test for 2 years. So I knew all the answers. So I took the test, and then I took it up there and I explained to the woman, "This is not going to be accurate because I grade this test at my job." Well, she didn't pass that piece of information along. And so my counselor in treatment had me down as having an IQ of Mensa, like 160 or some shit. I I didn't know this. I just know that I had a little, it was like in this motel thing, and I had this little biker guy who they were really happy if he would like show up to group, because he was like fried, his brain was fried. And they weren't giving him much of anything. But boy, she had me reading a few chapters a night and writing those journals, and she just piled it on me, and I'm getting resentful and more mad and all. So I confronted her. I'm like, why are you picking on me? Why are you picking on me? She said, I'm not picking on you. She said, your IQ is so high that we have to keep you. I'm like, no, you don't understand. I'm mentally retarded. And she said, no, you can't be mentally retarded. You scored high. I said, well, the reason I scored high is because I graded it. She said, well, you're not mentally retarded. I said, yes, I am. And she said, you can't be mentally retarded. And I'm like, well, how do you figure? She said, don't you have a high school diploma? And I said, well, yes. And she said, what was your grade point average? I said, I don't know. She said, did you fail a lot of classes? I said, no, I never failed a class. She said, you never failed a class? And I said, no. And then she went on, she said, and you're holding a job, did you fill out the job application? I'm like, well, yeah. She said, you're not retarded. She said, you are above average IQ. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh, shit, what if I'm not retarded? Because I had not really considered, I had never tried anything because I thought I couldn't, type of deal. So anyway, the other thing that happened in treatment was I was given a lot of information about Alcoholics Anonymous. We had to go to meetings. I hated them, but I was given information. So the way I got out of all that was when I went back, I made it through treatment. I was a star pupil. I was very spiritual. Other thing that happened in there. So this was in 1985, and we had a counselor, and then we had a minister. And my minister, when I told him I was gay, got very flustered and said, we really need to talk about this. He said, when I was in high school, I thought that I might be gay too, but it turns out I'm not. He said, but here's the deal. If you will not have any kind of sexual activity for 6 to 9 months, you can change. And I remember looking, because I didn't want to change at that point. I mean, I cared less. And I looked at him and I said, does that mean if you stop having sex, you're going to turn gay? What does this mean? And he just, that was not funny to him. I was just like, how does this make any sense? Anyway, so I left there with like this chip on my, again, religion, type of deal. But anyway, I went back, tried to go back to work. I couldn't, it didn't work. So I went to the prosecuting attorney that had, taken the case. And I thanked him profusely for saving my life. Thank you so much. You saved my life. I have learned my lesson. Thank you so much. Is it okay if I move? Move to Mississippi. I got permission. They had those little cards you got to take to meetings. I filled it out in different handwriting with different colors. The back. Within 30 days of being there, I was drunk again. And I wasn't ready. But the next year was hell. I ended up in Albuquerque. My sister sent me a plane ticket. I ended up in Albuquerque and was drinking. I was working as a nursing assistant in a nursing home. Was at night shift. I always worked at nights because the administration wasn't there, so you could get away with a lot more. I would drink. I would get off work, be at the liquor store when it opened, get my bottle of Southern Comfort because it's the grand old drink of the South. And in my mind it was a big deal, and I would get drunk and then go to work hungover and smelling, and anyway, ended up quitting that job and going to work for an agency, and was living with my sister, and I was throwing up all the time. I had a little hangover kit. I would get up and and take the stuff and throw it up and take it again, and it was awful. And I was shaking. I couldn't even sign in, and I was shaking so bad. And I just knew. I was done. I was just so done. So I told my sister, I said, I think I need to go back to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I did not want to because I'd had such a bad experience, but I knew there wasn't going to be anywhere else to go. And this is my family. She said, I don't think you give yourself enough credit for the control you have. I just don't understand why there's all those empty bottles under your bed. Hello? That's like a week's worth of bottles. I think she thought it was like months worth, it was like a week's. I used to go travel to another neighborhood to throw my bottles away, so nobody knew how much I was drinking. But anyway, so I went into November 7th, 1986, I went to a group called the Foothills Group in Albuquerque. And it was about as different an energy in that room than the one I'd been in Kansas. They were so happy to see me. They were, it was I don't know, a very warm, I came in, I was young, and I felt very awkward, and they were just so happy to have a newcomer. And I was shaking, and I was having to drink my coffee off the table, and all that stuff, and they were just so happy. I don't remember much about the first meeting, but I remember someone saying, "You never have to drink again." And I remember thinking, God, if only I didn't have to drink again, because I could not drink at that point. And they kept telling me to keep coming back, and so I did. And if I remember right, and this is 36, 37, whatever years ago, I was not working, so I was they had 7 meetings a day at this place, and I was just sort of living there, going to meeting after meeting after meeting. And then I got work. So anyway, I had decided that maybe the problem was alcohol, so I tried the marijuana maintenance. And I wasn't smoking it all the time, but I had some old friends, and I didn't want to lose my friends because they, my good buddies, and so we would go out and smoke a little bit and all, and got where I really didn't like it, but I didn't want to give it up and all, and anyway. So then I was told I needed to get a sponsor, so I asked a bunch of women if they'd sponsor me, and of course they said no, because I wasn't going to tell them I was gay, so they thought I was hitting on them. And finally I found a guy who was just very handsome and very, very mellow and peaceful, and I thought, you're the sponsor for me, you'll be gentle. And at first he was, until the day, February 4th is my birthday. February 4th of 1987, I went out to eat with these friends of mine, and we got really, really high, and I hated it. And so a couple days later, I called him up and said, I think I'm ready to stop smoking weed. And he went, you're still smoking weed? I went, well, yeah. And he said, you can't be smoking weed. That's not sobriety. I'm like, the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And he said, no. That's not what we do here. If you're altering yourself, you're just using the, I can't think of the word, the substance for alcohol, the solid substance for alcohol, if I was doing pills or whatever. And I argued with him. I'm like, I'm not changing I had 90 days. I was not going to lose that 90 days. And he said, you need to get on us. He said, you need to go there and get a white chip and start over. And I'm like, I'm not going to do it. He said, I'll tell you what. Go to the meeting and tell them what happened and see what kind of feedback you get. So I'm like, okay. So I went to this poor meeting, and I brought this up, which, in AA, it's like a crime to bring up drugs, right? But here I am, I'm like, okay, so I've been smoking weed, but I quit. But my sponsor wants me to change my sobriety date, but I told him the only requirement. So I went around, and people were really, really good. They were like, I think it was me, I would have to change my sobriety date. I think I would have to be honest, because that's not really sober. And other people, pretty much the consensus of the whole group was probably that wasn't sober. Except one guy. And he was like this, I don't know, kind of hippie sort of. He was probably about 40 and just kind of I don't know. He's someone that you would see in a bar that was like a lounge lizard. A hippie lounge lizard. And he became indignant. He said, no, the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. I smoke pot whenever it comes around. Occasionally it comes around, I smoke pot. And so I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So anyway, after that, it's like every meeting, he would follow me out with tracts, with the little pamphlets and, all this information and how good marijuana was for me and all. And he started bugging the hell out of me. And he was crazy as shit. He just was a nut, And he was married to this woman, and I was like, what is going on? She goes, well, let me tell you about this whenever it comes around. It comes around 5 or 6 times a day for him. Had it not been for him, I would not have changed my sobriety date. I did not want what he had. I was scared that I was going to end up like that. So I did. I changed my sobriety date to February 5th of 1987. Right about that time, shortly there, well, no, about a year later, a couple moved from Texas named Rita and Mark, and I became friends with them. And I'm telling you that now because this is going to come into play a little bit later in the story. But anyway, I got really involved in AA. I loved it. My first sponsor, the good-looking guy, fired me, and I got another sponsor. And I was going to meetings and going out to coffee afterwards. And I had a job, and I had my little apartment and all that stuff. I was still relying on my family for cars and stuff, but I was doing the best I could. Anyway, at 5 years of sobriety. I'd been working at a treatment center. I decided to move to Nashville. And so my roommate and I moved to Nashville. And I started going to meetings there. And I stopped working as a nursing assistant, started my other career, which is like doing readings for people. But anyway, that was awesome. I grew a lot there. It was amazing. I had 5 years of sobriety. I celebrated it there. And then I was given the opportunity to move to South Carolina, and I went out there and got involved in AA out there, and stayed sober. And then eventually I was called back to Albuquerque. I had to go back to Albuquerque, which I really didn't want to go back to Albuquerque, but I went. And I went back to my home group, and the whole thing. I had 7 years of sobriety, and the whole dynamics of the group had changed in 2 years. Everything had changed. There were new people that came in, and some of the old people had gone, and my sponsor had moved away. And so anyway, it was also during that time that I started having heavy bouts of depression, where I would go home and just sit there and go, what's the use? I don't even have the energy to get up, type of deal. And then I was couldn't stay awake and all that stuff. So. And it just got worse over the next, few years. So, at 9 years of sobriety, on August 30th of 1996, I was at work, and I got a phone call that Mark Mann, the guy that, Margarita, had stabbed his 6-year-old son to death with a screwdriver. My whole world went upside down, totally upside down. Rita and Mark had divorced at that point in time, and so I rushed to Rita's side. And for the next few months, I stuck with her through this. It was the most horrible thing I've ever been through. To see a mother lose a child and go through that soul, But what's really sick about the thing was it was feeding my ego. I was the hero. I've always wanted to be the hero. And the television and the newspapers were there because it was this big story about the kid with the screwdriver, and it was made national news, and I was recording all the news things and sitting through the court and all, and then I had to give a deposition, and I was really important. And so I gave a deposition, and I was as honest as I could possibly be. And anyway, because of the deposition, they had me testify against him at the Bell hearing. And I had to face him and tell, all I knew about him. And it was the weirdest, surrealistic thing I had ever been through in my life. The next day on the front of the newspaper, it had my name next to his, and we were friends from Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was just like, oh shit, there goes that tradition. And Rita was it just progressively got worse with her. And about that time, February 5th of 97, I celebrated 10 years of sobriety. And shortly after that, right around that time, I started really craving smoking marijuana again and all that stuff. And I talked with everyone, and I just couldn't shake this thing. And then Rita started smoking weed. And so May 1st, I was given a store. It's really weird how that worked out. I was given a store. And I went to a big celebration thing. And when I was there, I was sitting on, I'd gone to a meeting the day before, and I was sitting on this rock, and I'm like, God, I can't fight this anymore. If I'm supposed to get high, then I'm going to get high. There's nothing I can do about it. You're going to have to just figure this out. And I swear to God, 15 minutes later, I'm walking down the scene. Some of my customers came and stuck a lit joint in my mouth. I swear to you. And I was like, okay, God, thank you. Really, thank you. Woohoo! I inhaled. I thought, yes. And it was on. And I knew from that moment I was in relapse. There was no question in my mind I was in relapse. But I was so relieved to be in relapse, because once again I had that feeling. So for the next 6 months I just kind of did the thing, and at November 7th of 1997, 11 years from the day I took my last drink, I went to the liquor store and got a bottle, and you know what? It was on. All that other shit went away, and I was drinking again. And I've never been so happy to be drinking in my life. I had stopped going to AA. I think my favorite part of that early relapse, so this is so wrong, but 3 people from my AA group showed up at my store to have an intervention. And it turns out that I was the only one in that group that had ever done an intervention. So they didn't know what they were doing, so I kind of led my own intervention. But I told them, I'm like, I'm not going to quit. I have no desire to quit. Whatever. I know where to go if I want to, but I'm not going to. Meanwhile, oh God, okay, I'm going to get sober eventually. Meanwhile, there's a gal that shows up. My store was across the street from the fairgrounds. And she shows up and we're partying together. She's 24. And she moves in with this guy. I didn't know it at the time, but she'd already had 2 children, and she split, abandoned them. And anyway, she got pregnant. And she didn't want the baby. And she was opposed to abortion. And so I told her, I said, if all else fails and the baby's not all messed up, I'll just go on the birth certificate with the father and I'll take the baby. Thinking she would never do it. November 2nd of 1998, I became a father of a child, yeah. He's 24 today and he will not leave home. Anyway, so I'm in relapse. I have a child. I end up getting very, very, very ill, and ended up in Arkansas in Horseshoe Bend first. And while I was there, I got really, really sick. It turns out I had severe sleep apnea and depression, and I didn't know it. And I got that diagnosed, and once that was diagnosed, I moved to Cherokee Village and started to school. July 8th of 2003, I went back to AA. It was a miserable time. I was just soul weary at this point. Went back to AA. The next month I started to college, and for the first 7 years of my sobriety this time I was in college. And I am the only mentally retarded person that ended up being a professor at ASU. I did. I taught there. No, you're not. But anyway, so that's what I did for the first 7 years. Came to meetings, started doing service work. After that ended, I worked at the treatment center. So I want to, kind of rush to the end of this. I know I got lost in the story, but here's what I have learned about sobriety. The first thing is, my sobriety really has nothing to do with me. It did at first. My sobriety, my chips were all about me. I was so glad to get my white chip and so on and so forth. But at about a year of sobriety, when I was going to get my year chip, I really didn't want to get my chip. And someone pulled me aside and said, you're not getting your chip for you. You're getting your chip to prove to other people this works and to be grateful to the group. This isn't about you. Well, how dare you? I did this. I ended up moving to Jonesboro to go to ASU. And I learned through this process that whenever we go to a new group, I carried my old ideas with me. And so it took me a while to adjust to this group not doing it right. right? And so he hit his bottom. Anyway, so I had to learn to curb my ego about how AA should work. I used to be very confrontational. I would call people out of meetings and so on and so forth. I had to cool that down a little bit and learn that I was not the AA police. And I learned in here too that, you know, I have done the work. I've done the steps over and over again. I show up, I do service work and all. But God's keeping me sober. My higher power, which I call the universe, is keeping me sober. I am just an open vessel. And I know a lot of you may not, who just getting to know me may not know this, but this is a much gentler, softer Roy than ever before. In sobriety, I have acquired a house. I didn't think I'd ever have a house. I have a house. I've lived there for 13 years. I don't know if I share it with a bank, but anyway, I have a house. I have a dog that's 12 years old. I've had it since it was a pup. My son is alive and well and thriving. He doesn't do things like I think he should, but he's okay. Both my parents have died of sobriety. Really no big deal. As a matter of fact, they both were old and in bad health, so when they died, we were prepared. And I come back from my mother's funeral, I came in here, and people were like, I am so sorry your mother died, and I said, she had it coming. And they gasped, But she did, she was ready to go. I love my mother. There was no animosity when I said it. I thought it was funny. But she did have it coming. It was the best thing that ever happened at that point in her life. 2 months before she died, she ate her hearing aid. Who wants to live like that? So it was, perfect healing. I've had 3 major surgeries. 4 major surgeries in sobriety. No big deal. I made it through. It's interesting because, we're taught not to take the pain meds, but I'm also allergic to pain. So after the thing, they would give me like morphine. I would do the morphine. I'm like, okay, I don't need the morphine. And they give me the hydrocodone. I do a couple of those. And I found out with most of my pain, I'm more scared of pain than the actual pain happening. And I made it through almost everything on Tylenol. It's really bizarre that way, what my mind does. My mind's just looking for an excuse to overdo type of deal. I had the gastric bypass in 2015. Best thing I ever did. I was so miserable. I dropped 100 pounds. It's just made a big difference. I have done these things because I'm sober. I would not have done any of that. I'm sure I'd be dead, because nothing would have been diagnosed. But what's really amazing is that I have a group of people in here that love me, and I don't question it. I used to, anytime anyone did anything, I was always looking for the ulterior motive. I have come in here pissed. I have come in here so funny, so emotionally high, and all this stuff. And y'all just put up with me. Occasionally someone pulls me aside and say, you really shouldn't do that. And after I tell them to F off, then I go home and I go, okay, I probably shouldn't do that. I get a little defensive. I can see no downside to sobriety. I've had a lot of hard lessons in sobriety, but they're lessons. And my philosophy is, if you don't have friction, you don't make progress. You've got to have that to grow. And so I don't always I'm going through something right now that I would just soon not, but I can't wait to see how it comes out. There's always this amazing, okay, I got to talk about miracles. I got time. So I'm a miracle. That was a hard thing to live up to. Being a retarded miracle was very, very confusing. But I'm a miracle. That's what I was raised to believe. I had decided I would be okay if I never need another miracle again as long as I live, and here's why. The first half of miracles have to suck. There has got to be a crisis. Otherwise, you don't need a miracle. I'm glad miracles exist. I'm a firm believer in them. But there's usually so much pain where you have to admit defeat and that there's no other solution but universal influence. So I'm okay if I never need another miracle. I probably will, but I would really be okay. But I also today am sitting in a room full of miracles. None of us really should be sober. because it's a fatal progressive disease, but yet here we are. How weird. Most of you, well, none of you I would have drank with because I drank at home. Most of you I would have never met. So, and you probably wouldn't have met me, which may or may not be a good thing, but anyway. So that's all I've got. Thank you all for being here tonight. That's all.